Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Eloqua Office Hours, Forethought Marketing's monthly discussion for Eloqua professionals. I'm Richard Holder, and I'll be your host today. This presentation will be recorded, and a link will be sent to you tomorrow via email if you'd like to watch a replay or share it with someone else. We do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This allows us to make sure we get to everyone's question and have a record of it. You may ask questions for today's topics, or you may also ask questions that we might consider for future sessions. So please feel free to use the Q&A liberally. Joining me today is Quina Kui, who is a marketing automation consultant here at Forethought Marketing, who will share a solution for adding a snooze options to help avoid unsubscribes. After Queena's remarks, David York, the CEO and founder of SureShot.io, will be our special guest speaker. So with that brief introduction, let's dive in and turn the time over to Quina. Go ahead.
Thanks for introduction and welcome everybody. Today I'm going to go over the essentials of a snooze program, and this is called many things in our world of marketing. And the thing here that we need to keep in mind as marketers is primarily, and nowadays, people are frustrated. They are over bombarded with your messages, your company's messages, and possibly your partner's messages. So our goal today is to understand what we can do about this. We know as we send out emails, by compliance and privacy rules, we have to offer an option to stop all emails. And that in itself represents how advanced you are as a marketing organization. And for better for worse, different companies will have an opt-out page that gives you the basics of having clear messaging, telling the user what they're removing themselves from, what they are allowed to do as a digital citizen, and the related components of any subscriber to have clear compliance with rules is confirmation email, a page, any additional wording on your privacy policy, and also if there's any other complaints, what the customer can do after they've opted out. And what we're going to discuss today is really understanding what is this person opting out look like? What are they seeing? What have they experienced? And so even as we as marketers are so used to lead generation, demand generation, even retention, many companies have forgotten what are these people at the crossroads of wanting to be forgotten completely from your company. Here's some questions for you to consider as a way to understand this cohort of users. How old is this person? So what is the earliest date they've entered your entire ecosystem? And does that make them old in terms of 3 years? Have they been in the system for 5 years, migrated from another system? Have they been receiving emails for 7 years through another partner? Second bullet point, what kind of user really wants to opt out? Are these generally people that have been in the pipeline for 2 years? Have they become an opportunity at some point through your sales process, but then maybe decided it wasn't the right timing, but then all of the other materials and webinars and information puts them as a lead, and as a lead, they maybe want to opt out. Third bullet point, does the user actually want to be removed from your messaging? Maybe you offer a product, a monthly promotion, and that product can be relevant to them down the line, but they just don't like every newsletter they're getting. Fourth bullet point, how much detailed information are you going to give this user at the moment they choose to modify their subscription? And the last one, how tolerant of the user is of your company. If you're a financial company, they understand you're going to be sending lots of notices, regulations, and details about laws, billing, finances. They may understand, okay, it's very fair that I'm going to get a lot, but I'm still annoyed. So they may still want to receive some communication, and that is your tiny window as a marketer to be able to provide them with value, and even their value that you provide can be on a way for them to manage their preferences. From a marketing perspective, let's think about you as a marketer in your company. You have goals you have metrics, you have objectives and initiatives. Having all of that go into funnel where the user is ready to leave is really alarming. Not to mention, you as a marketer may be responsible for transactional messages. How we need to think about the snooze program and ways to pause customer communications in relation to all of the other mandatory messages. That's the first bullet point. The second thing you might want to understand about the people who are wanting to snooze or just fed up with your emails are the average and open click rate of this audience in particular. And what I mean by that, for example, is let's say for one group of users, they are prospects. They have been on your list for, let's say, 2 years. And then let's say 10% of those people completely unsubscribed from a large mass email you sent. How long have these 10% been opening and clicking? Because it may not be the same click and open rate as your newsletter. So taking some time to go into your analytics, work with your database analysts and understanding what is the actual data behind these, let's say 10% of people who unsubscribed. The other thing that you'll want to understand for marketing goals, there are people that want to leave your communications completely, but if you are going to consider trying to retain them, and when you try to retain them, there may be some pauses in communication. Will these people miss some ongoing onboarding campaigns? Will they miss some ongoing newsletters if that person is in manufacturing? Maybe your newsletter offers legal and compliance updates for the manufacturing industry. Will they miss them, and how much? And in terms of your own KPIs, really think about what amount of these people in a potential pause program will affect your KPIs. If you have, let's say, 100 people in a database and your KPIs are reporting on the click rates of, let's say, 5% of those people are clicking through, and let's say you have another 20% that are always opening. If you have a snooze program, where does that factor into your calculations? Are these people going to be considered in your metrics or not? Or you might have a separate dashboard for these people and say, we have 100 people in our marketing database right now, but we also have another 20 that are waiting to enter or re-enter after the snooze program. So thinking about what your marketing universe looks like with or without these people that you are potentially offering a pause. The other thing about your marketing and opt-outs nowadays is people are getting really tired. So of those people that are very close to unsubscribing, how much have they received? And to really understand the number of communications is essential. And that means as a marketer, you'll have to really understand the segments that they're in, if they're in one massive list, or maybe they're broken into multiple, or if the user always exists in your database, if they've been retrieved or if they've been pulled for a marketing request for you to fulfill and send in a message in the recent months. And then lastly, can the user be offered something else while they're in the snooze program? Let's say if the person is tired of marketing, but they want to still receive billing updates. Can that person still receive some other messaging legally in those billing updates? And we see this all the time with our utility bills. You may get a promotion or how to save energy. And this is a perfect example of that. But here we're trying to do this in our email world. So for you as a marketer, really start thinking about this audience of people that are just about to unsubscribe as their own cohort of data for you to analyze and go deeper into. There's a quick question from Q&A. Are there canned reports and insight that have some of these unsubscribe analysis? Currently, at the moment, no. If you have an analyzer license, there are ways to look at this, which will require more segmentation filters and possibly campaign filters, depending on how complex your instance is. And so the goal here, what we're trying to present today is we need to give people a coffee break, a vacation, a time to just rest. And this happens often with many lists, is that the longer time in between messages or in between emails, you actually get a spike in engagement. because it's been a while. Perhaps the sender name is familiar to them. So the person reading this email might say, let me see what this message is about. And that can increase your engagement. This is what we're trying to do with a snooze program. And so one easy thing you can do if you do want to consider this for your company is think about counting. Well, you can use a tally board. You can use Post-it notes in a whiteboard session with your team. You can even use a calendar view if you have a marketing calendar. Take a simple tally of one email address and count. There's also contact overlap reports in Eloqua that you can use that are going to help you with that, but that's only one look at the number of times a contact receives an email. If you have duplicates, that increases the problem a little bit more. But you can always start with thinking, if I'm one individual, and I've seen this in one company where they were in healthcare, the person was receiving 20 emails a day, and that was including their upcoming healthcare visit, the facility directions, parking directions, and then all of the other healthcare billing that came with it. So in your organization, really think about the user and just give a count. It can be really rough, but if you know you're at a point of, let's say 5, maybe for some organizations that's acceptable in 1 week. But if you're nearing to the double digits, this is where a snooze program can really help. So the elements of a snooze program can include the housing. You want to give a seamless customer experience. If someone was to unsubscribe, they should see the same thing for a snooze program. You don't want to give any people a surprise page that looks way different than your branding. You can get a little bit carried away with, trying to keep them as marketers. I think it's so often you want to offer more. Let's wait a minute and think about the messaging, the second red dot here. Clarify and really be concise about what it is you're offering. You're not allowing them to completely leave. Hey, why don't you wait a minute and think about what are some other time periods that you'd want to hold out of messaging for? Pause time. With a recent client, we talked about 1 week, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks, but they said, no, let's try 6 months. So for some businesses, can you afford in terms of KPI, in terms of lead generation? Can you wait 6 months for this person to potentially receive an email again? You might say yes, and other companies might say no. So really think about what is the impact on your marketing universe if you pause people for that time frame. And then a wake-up period. After people are paused in a program, you do want to re-enter this contact into your system. And that can either be with a program, a campaign, an ongoing list, a segment, many ways to do this. But to know that an essential part of the program is to be ready with you as a marketing team to have assets lined up for that person. If in the chance the person is already on your website in 6 months and they did choose to download a white paper or attend a webinar, great. But you got to be ready for assets and tagging and making sure all your database is set up for that person to mark them as a person's woken up. And then compliance as usual, staying compliant no matter what we do in our marketing. So I'll run through a live example. We have here a page where a person has same look and feel as an unsubscribe page, and then they are being able to opt out. They are able to pause, as you can see clearly in the wording, pause your subscription. And so your wording can be just a simple 1 sentence. Sorry, let me advance. For this particular customer, they chose to do a drop-down option for the time period of these emails. And so these can be the time periods that you select. Apologies, let my screen go forward. And in the system in Eloqua, it can be built as a program or it can be built as a campaign. So you could see the different periods here, 1, 3, or 6 months as this client had chosen. They also manage a form submit for the previous page you saw, and then removing them from that snooze shared list is how they do it here, but you're always welcome to use other options. From here, the shared list was most convenient. And then in some. So think about this as a long-term program. You want to, secondly, consider that you are still nearing the end of the subscription journey. in the business of keeping the customer happy. And third, you want to experiment and test. One snooze program may not be accurate. You may want to tweak the timeline and the cadence. And then fourthly, be sure to share this with your other marketing team. And you are still in the business of retention and keeping this in person engaged. So if you have any questions about the implementation, feel free to submit questions as we go in the comments and Q&A, and we'll get to them.
Great, Queena. Thank you very much for that presentation. I do have one outstanding question, and I'm going to summarize this just a little bit. But the person is asking, so if we think that people are getting too many emails, how is the best way to identify the email or the campaigns, I should say, that are the culprits?
Most easily, you can look at an email analysis report, and that will tell you if look holistically and think about what are the main culprits. You will generally find that you want to look at this by time. So if you run a report based on 1 week, you'll easily see a spike in your unsubscribes. You can, if you have dashboards set up, this will also be a better way to tell you. Other than that, I would rely on the email analysis reports.
Great, thank you. All right, in the interest of time, let's move forward and give the screen over to David. David York is a MarTech industry veteran with over 24 years of experience. He is a former marketing leader and senior Eloqua marketing consultant. Queena, if you could release the share. There we go. And he drives the product vision at SureShot, which has resulted in many integration awards and innovations. We're very grateful to have you with us here today, David.
Great, thanks for having me, Richard. Happy to be here and to be talking about data quality. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Looks like that's sharing. So we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to try and kind of fly through this. We're really going to be talking about data validation in particular, but I would be remiss if I didn't kind of at a high level discuss the idea around some of the key metrics, in this case, kind of 6 metrics that we think about at SureShot when it comes to measuring data quality, reach, the ability to contact your customers across different channels, validation, which we'll be talking about more specifically here, standardization, which obviously we're thinking about how well our data adheres to a standard set of values, our total addressable market, i.e., do we have the data in our database that actually meets the needs of the companies and the contacts that we're trying to reach. Enrichment, most everyone knows what enrichment is, but having additional data points and elements beyond what is captured through traditional methods. So thinking about beyond the form, what kind of data can we get? This could be scoring data, intent data, anything beyond kind of the standard stuff. And then completeness, right? How complete is our data across all of the key fields that we need? So these are just some metrics and dimensions, or some ways that you might want to measure that quality. When we think about validation specifically, validation, as I've kind of defined it, is the measurement of quality of specific pieces of data that can be verified for proper formatting or a third party. So when you think about validation, right, it's not necessarily, every field needs to be validated. But when we think about things like an email address, where we know it has a certain format, we know email addresses can be valid versus invalid. They can be, various states of quality, or a phone number. There are, databases and systems and services that can tell us if a phone number is good or bad, if an address is good or bad. You interact with things like this on a day-to-day basis when you are filling out your address and they ask you, hey, is this your address? And they verify that, right? So email falls into that category as well. So when we think about validation, we're really looking to say, okay, these are specific fields that we know can actually be validated, right? We know that, Mickey Mouse at mickeymouse.com is not a valid email, but we can actually go in and verify that with a third party. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. And I'm going to just do some live demos of some services that help us from a validation standpoint. But the last thing I'll cover before we kind of jump into that is kind of the dimensions that I would suggest that you consider when you're thinking about data quality. So, and what I mean by dimensions are really is where is data capture or data quality important to you as a marketer, right? So if we're thinking about when data is coming inbound to our database or to our marketing automation system, inbound could be, a form submission. It could be a list upload. It could be, an integration. When data is coming inbound, that's a dimension where you want to be thinking about, the quality of that data as it's being input into that system. Then there's this kind of concept of ongoing data quality. So as data is being processed, being updated, being changed, being used, are we having issues with the quality of our data as it's traversing through all of our different systems, as we're leveraging it in here or there, as it's being updated by, for example, the example Queenie gave was a preferences form, right? That's kind of that ongoing data. And then lastly, outbound. So when we're thinking about the activation of our data, and the best example that I kind of always go back to is when we're getting ready to send a campaign out, right? Do we know that every first name value is going to be accurate and usable in that campaign? When data is going outbound, as we're activating that data, do we know that that data quality exists in that area so that we have confidence in the personalization, or if we're doing dynamic content, or the rules that are going to be driving that content, right? Are we getting the most accurate data there? So those are some areas from a data quality standpoint when you're thinking about that across different dimensions that you want to consider, along with those kind of 6 different metrics for measurement. If you kind of look at those together, you're really thinking about how that data looks and feels and the quality of it holistically across the database and the different types of data and all the different ways that it should be, checked for quality, and then in all the different places that data is existing and being used. So that's the starting point. But again, we're going to talk about validation. So I'm going to show kind of a live demo of a form that's been integrated with third-party validation. And I will tell you explicitly, this form is very ugly. We're really focusing the time and the energy here on the actual services of validation. So we actually, I have 2 third-party data services. One is an email validation service. The other is a phone validation service that can be included in a form using JavaScript to then drive an additional level of validation. So most folks have, on a form, they have some form of email validation that says, hey, this needs to contain an @ sign. It needs to end with a, a .com or a something. It has to have X number of characters. That's kind of your basic standard validation. But in this case, we're actually running this up against a third party that will return back if the email is actually valid. And it uses a variety of different data points to be able to do that. The message that's returned in this demo is very, very plain and basic. We're just kind of showing what the API can return, but these messages can be configured and customized to where you can, look at this. So customers that we work with see this to help, remove things like CAPTCHA off of their forms, or if they have certain forms that, get a lot of spam on them and so forth, they're able to, kind of reduce the amount of spam that's coming in. So this, when I tab out of this, you'll see, hey, the API went, almost immediately and returned back a success message. The same thing will go through with the phone number. It'll say, hey, this was successful. And you'll see that. So these are all, again, third-party APIs that are doing this in real time to say, hey, this is a good number, or this is a good email address. So if I go in and just change the domain of my email address to sureshot.com, which is not valid, it'll actually say, hey, this is actually not a registerable email address. Like I said, we can customize and configure, and you can customize and configure these messages that are coming back so it can, present a certain language, but it immediately shows that. And if I put in an invalid phone number, the same thing is going to show me like, hey, this is an invalid phone number. So this is a good example of that kind of inbound dimension of data quality. It's like, hey, we can actually use, third-party services. And the cost of these is relatively simple. We're talking about, roughly on average, slightly a penny or slightly above per validation. So it's not expensive, but it gives you the ability to go in and kind of add that extra dimension of validation to the data that's coming inbound on any of your web forms. Secondarily, when we talk about kind of the second and third dimensions of ongoing and outbound, you can, add services like this to your campaign or program canvases to do the same type of thing, right? So I want to be able to, as data is coming in from, lists or from CRM or from other places, I want to actually go through and validate that. And so this is just a cloud app that we have that just goes in and says, hey, check out the mobile phone and the country code, validate those. There's some mapping where there's data that's actually coming back into Eloqua. And then I'm just going to run a quick test, because this will just give us a view of, what this API is actually returning. So the API actually says, hey, this is a valid phone number. It can show that it's a mobile phone. We can show even the carrier. It can tell me if it's a landline and things like that. So we can get a lot of details back from some of these APIs. In a form, we might capture that on the back end. In the app inside of a campaign canvas, we would actually, be able to add that data back into the contact field or into a custom data object. So that was a quick tour, but happy to answer any questions about the validation services and capabilities.
Thank you very much, David. We do have a few questions here I'd love to get to. So the first one is kind of an obvious question. Says, where does this validation service come? And then he goes on to ask, who are the data providers? Is it recommended by Eloqua? Can you talk a little bit about this kind of service?
Yeah, so these are third parties. There are a number of parties that you can, go find. We actually, as a partner, have relationships with a variety of them, companies like Fresh Address, Never Bounce, Bright Verify, Twilio, to do a lot of the validation. And yes, the second part of that. So Eloqua doesn't, I don't think, have any recommended ones. I would say we have worked with most of these vendors for years and years. We have recommendations. And then the other one would be, the other part of that question is that there is the ability to do mass validation. So that can be done in mass. When we're working with folks, we'll oftentimes say, hey, let's validate what existing data sets or specific lists, and then do the ongoing moving forward, whether in a program or campaign or on a web form or both.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we are at the end of our time here. David, I want to thank you for your time today. And full disclosure, David's company, SureShot, is a provider of these services. And as you've seen in his presentation, he sources his data from a variety of vendors, so forth. But there are also others that you could look to, and we really appreciate David talking about this today. All right, so our next